The dust cloud rose higher than any funeral pyre Zelda Emerson had ever seen, and she knew with absolute certainty that if she didn't keep moving forward, she would die out here under this merciless Arizona sun. 3 weeks ago, her father had collapsed beside the chuck wagon, his heart giving out without warning, leaving her alone with 200 head of cattle and a promise she had sworn to keep. The herd needed to reach the railhead in Prescott by the end of September 1883, or they would lose everything: the ranch, the land her grandmother had homesteaded, every memory her family had built over 30 years. So Zelda had buried her father in a shallow grave marked with stones, said a prayer that caught in her throat like barbed wire, and kept the cattle moving north. Her hands were raw beneath her leather gloves, blistered and bleeding from the constant grip on the reins. The sorrel mare beneath her had grown as weary as Zelda felt, but the animal never faltered, sensing perhaps that both their lives depended on reaching civilization. 21 years old, and Zelda had never imagined she would be doing this alone. Her father had taught her everything about ranching, about reading the land and the sky, about understanding cattle and their strange collective mind. But he had never prepared her for the loneliness that came with being the only human voice for miles in every direction. The herd moved sluggishly in the afternoon heat, their bellowing a constant backdrop to her thoughts. She had learned to sleep in the saddle for brief moments, trusting her horse to maintain the pace while exhaustion pulled her under. At night, she would tie the mare to a mesquite tree and try to rest, but every sound jerked her awake. Every coyote howl, every shifting of hooves, every whisper of wind through the creosote bushes. She had lost 12 head to dehydration and exhaustion, their bodies left behind as markers of her journey, and the guilt of each loss carved itself deeper into her conscience. The land here was unforgiving, all red rock and endless sky, dotted with saguaro cacti that stood like silent witnesses to her struggle. Superior, Arizona had been the last town she had passed through, a copper mining settlement where she had bought supplies and received suspicious glances from men who thought a woman had no business doing what she was attempting. The clerk at the general store had tried to convince her to sell the herd there for whatever she could get, but Zelda knew the cattle were worth 3 times as much in Prescott. Her family's survival depended on getting top dollar, not panic selling to opportunists who smelled desperation. She rationed her water carefully, knowing the next reliable source was still 2 days ahead if her calculations were correct. The map her father had marked was crumpled and stained with sweat in her saddlebag, and she studied it each evening by firelight, tracing the route with fingers that trembled from fatigue. The cattle were getting thinner, their ribs showing through their hides, and she knew she was pushing them too hard, but there was no choice. Stop, and they might never start again. Stop, and she might never find the strength to continue. On the morning of the 23rd day, as the sun painted the eastern horizon in shades of orange and gold, Zelda saw a rider approaching from the north. Her hand moved instinctively to the rifle in her saddle holster, though she was so tired she wondered if she could even lift it. The rider came on steadily, and as he drew closer, she could make out details. A tall man on a blue roan horse, wearing a dark hat and a worn leather vest. He raised one hand in greeting, a gesture that seemed neither threatening nor overly friendly, just an acknowledgement of one traveler to another. "Morning," he called when he was close enough to be heard over the sound of the herd. His voice was deep and carried a hint of something Zelda could not quite identify, concern perhaps, or curiosity. "Morning," she replied, her own voice hoarse from disuse. She had barely spoken in weeks except to curse at stubborn cattle or to pray when the despair grew too heavy. He pulled his horse alongside hers, matching her pace as the herd continued its slow progress north. Up close, she could see he was perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that were startlingly blue against his sun-bronzed skin. A scar ran along his jawline, a thin white line that spoke of some old violence, but his expression was open, almost gentle. "That is a lot of cattle for one person," he said, and there was no judgment in his tone, only observation. "It is all I have," Zelda answered, too tired for pride or pretense. "They need to reach Prescott by month's end." He nodded slowly, his gaze sweeping over the herd with what looked like professional assessment. "You have come far," from outside of Tucson, 3 weeks on the trail. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of what might have been respect or admiration. "Alone." "My father was with me when we started. He died on the 4th day out." The words were flat, emotionless, because Zelda had no emotion left to give them. She had cried herself empty in the first week, and now there was only the need to keep moving, to honor her promise, to save what could be saved. The stranger was quiet for a long moment, the only sounds the shuffling of hooves and the creaking of leather. Finally, he said, "My name is Isaac Calloway. I have been working ranches in the territory for the better part of 10 years. If you would accept the help, I would be willing to ride with you the rest of the way to Prescott." Zelda turned to look at him fully, searching his face for any sign of ulterior motive, but she saw only sincerity. "Why would you do that? You do not know me." Isaac adjusted his hat against the climbing sun. "Because nobody should have to do something like this alone. And because I can see you are determined enough to try, which means you will probably die trying if someone does not help." The bluntness of his assessment should have offended her, but instead, Zelda felt something crack open inside her chest, some tight knot of fear and pride that she had been holding on to for so long. "I cannot pay you, not until the cattle are sold." "I am not asking for payment," Isaac said. "Consider it a courtesy from one cattleman to another." She wanted to argue, to maintain her independence, to prove she could do this without help, but the exhaustion was a weight pressing down on her shoulders, and the relief of not being alone anymore was too powerful to resist. "All right," she said quietly. "I would be grateful for your company, Mr. Calloway." "Isaac," he corrected. "And what should I call you, Zelda?" "Zelda Emerson." He smiled then, a small expression that transformed his face from merely handsome to something that made Zelda's tired heart skip unexpectedly. "Well, Miss Emerson, let us get these cattle to Prescott." The difference his presence made was immediate and profound. That first day, Isaac took over managing the drag, keeping the stragglers moving while Zelda focused on the lead cattle. He had a natural way with the animals, a calm authority that they responded to, and for the first time in weeks, the herd moved with something resembling order. When they stopped for the night, Isaac showed her how to set up a proper camp, using his bedroll and supplies to supplement her meager provisions. "You have been living on hardtack and jerky?" he asked, examining her supplies with a slight frown. "And whatever I could shoot when I had time, which was not often." Isaac shook his head and pulled a bundle from his saddlebag. "Tonight, we have something better." He made a stew from dried beans and salt pork, seasoned with wild onions he found growing near their camp. The smell alone was enough to make Zelda's stomach clench with hunger, and when she finally tasted it, she thought it might be the most delicious thing she had ever eaten. She tried not to wolf it down too quickly, but Isaac noticed and quietly refilled her tin bowl without comment. After they ate, they sat by the small fire as darkness settled over the desert. The cattle were quiet, settled for the night, and the stars emerged in their thousands overhead. Zelda felt a strange awkwardness now that there was nothing demanding her immediate attention, as though she had forgotten how to simply exist in another person's presence. "Tell me about your ranch," Isaac said, breaking the silence. "The one you are trying to save." So Zelda talked, and the words came easier than she expected. She told him about her grandmother who had come west as a widow with 3 small children, about how she had claimed land when Arizona was still a territory fighting for statehood. She told him about her father, who had inherited his mother's determination and stubbornness, who had built the ranch into something profitable through decades of hard work. She told him about the drought 2 years ago that had forced them to sell off most of their breeding stock, and about this herd, their last chance to rebuild. Isaac listened without interruption, his eyes reflecting the firelight, and when she finished, he said, "Your grandmother sounds like she was a remarkable woman." "She was. She died when I was 12, but I still remember everything she taught me. She used to say that the land does not care if you are man or woman, it only cares if you are strong enough to hold on to it." "She was right about that," Isaac agreed. He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the night. "My own mother had similar ideas. She ran a boarding house in Denver after my father died in a mining accident, raised 5 children on what she earned cooking and cleaning for strangers. I was the oldest, so when I was 16, I headed south to find work so I could send money back to her." "You still," Zelda asked, "send money?" "When I can. My siblings are mostly grown now, making their own way, but I still visit when I get the chance. I have been in Arizona for 3 years, working different ranches, learning the country." "Where were you headed when you came across me?" Isaac smiled. "Nowhere in particular. I had just finished a job driving horses to Fort Verde, and I was taking my time getting to wherever seemed interesting next. I suppose fate decided that should be Prescott." Zelda felt her cheeks warm and was grateful for the darkness that hid her reaction. "Or coincidence?" "Maybe," Isaac said, but his tone suggested he did not entirely believe in coincidence. That night, Zelda slept more deeply than she had since her father died, comforted by the knowledge that someone else was keeping watch, that she was not solely responsible for every decision and every danger. When she woke before dawn, she found Isaac already up, tending to the horses and preparing coffee. He handed her a cup as she joined him, and she wrapped her hands around the warm tin, savoring both the heat and the simple kindness of the gesture. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. They pushed the herd hard but not cruelly, covering 15 miles when the terrain allowed, less when it grew too rough. Isaac knew the land well, guiding them to water sources Zelda would have missed, finding paths through the hills that saved hours of travel. They talked while they rode, sharing stories about their lives, their hopes, their understanding of this vast and often brutal territory they both called home. Zelda found herself watching Isaac when she thought he was not looking, noticing the competent way he handled every task, the kindness he showed to both animals and the person who rode beside him. He had a way of making even the most difficult moments feel manageable, his steady presence a counterweight to her anxiety and exhaustion. And sometimes, she caught him watching her with an expression she could not quite read, something warm and thoughtful that made her heart race in a way that had nothing to do with fear or exertion. On the 5th day after Isaac joined her, they encountered a band of Apache traveling east. Zelda's hand moved to her rifle, but Isaac shook his head slightly. "Wait," he said quietly. "Let them make the first move." The Apache numbered perhaps 20, men, women, and children on horseback with pack animals carrying their belongings. Their leader, an older man with gray streaking his long black hair, rode forward to meet them. He and Isaac exchanged words in a language Zelda did not understand, though she caught what sounded like friendly tones. After a few minutes of conversation, the Apache leader nodded toward the herd, said something else, and then he and his people continued on their way. "What did he say?" Zelda asked when they were alone again. "He said we have our hands full with so many cattle, and that we chose a difficult time to be crossing this country. The army has been active to the north, making everyone nervous. He wished us safe travels. You speak their language, some." "I worked for a rancher near San Carlos for a while, learned enough to be polite. It helps to be able to talk to your neighbors, even when the government would rather you did not." Zelda heard the edge of criticism in his voice, the suggestion of opinions about the way the territory was being run, the way native peoples were being treated. She found herself agreeing with the sentiment, though such thoughts were dangerous to voice in most company. That Isaac trusted her enough to hint at his beliefs made something tighten pleasantly in her chest. They crossed the Salt River on the 8th day of traveling together, fording at a shallow point where the water barely reached the horses' bellies. The cattle balked at first, reluctant to enter the current, but with both Zelda and Isaac working in coordination, they managed to get the herd across without losing a single animal. On the far bank, Isaac grinned at her, his face streaming with water and his clothes soaked through, and Zelda found herself grinning back, giddy with success and relief. "We make a good team," he said, and there was something in his voice that made the words feel like more than just an observation about herding cattle. "We do," Zelda agreed, her heart pounding hard enough that she wondered if he could hear it. That evening, they camped in a cottonwood grove where the grass was thick and green. The cattle spread out to graze, content after the stress of the river crossing, and for the first time since starting this journey, Zelda felt something close to optimism. They were making good time now, better than she had dared hope when she was alone, and Prescott was less than a week away if their luck held. After they ate, Isaac pulled a harmonica from his saddlebag and played a slow, melancholy tune that drifted through the gathering darkness. Zelda sat across the fire from him, listening, and found herself blinking back tears she could not quite explain. When the song ended, she said, "That was beautiful." "My mother's favorite," Isaac replied. "She used to sing it while she worked." "I am not much of a singer, but I can manage the melody on this." "I think she would be proud of you," Zelda said, "of the man you became." Isaac looked up at her, and in the firelight his eyes seemed to hold entire conversations they had not yet spoken aloud. "I hope so. Just as I think your father and grandmother would be proud of you. What you are doing, driving this herd alone for as long as you did, that takes courage most people could not imagine." "I was terrified every moment," Zelda admitted. "Courage is not the absence of fear. It is doing what needs to be done despite being afraid. You have that, Zelda. Anyone can see it." She wanted to deflect the compliment to diminish what she had done, but something in Isaac's expression told her he would not accept that. So instead, she said simply, "Thank you for everything. I would not have made it without you." "You would have," Isaac said with quiet certainty. "It would have been harder and you would have suffered more, but you would have made it. You are the kind of person who finishes what they start, no matter the cost." They sat in comfortable silence after that, and Zelda felt a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the fire. She was falling in love with Isaac Calloway, she realized with a mixture of wonder and terror. Falling in love with his kindness and his competence, with the way he treated her as an equal rather than someone to be protected or managed. Falling in love with the sound of his voice and the way he smiled when he was pleased about something. It was perhaps the worst possible timing, in the middle of a cattle drive with everything she owned at stake, but her heart apparently had no interest in practical considerations. The next day, they encountered their first serious trouble. A group of 5 men rode up from the south, rough-looking characters with hard eyes and weapons displayed prominently. Their leader, a heavy-set man with a thick mustache, reined in his horse and looked over the herd with obvious interest. "That is a fine bunch of cattle," he said, his tone casual but his intent clear. "Where are you folks headed, Prescott?" Isaac answered, positioning his horse slightly in front of Zelda's in a gesture that was protective without being obvious. "Railhead. Long way still to go. Dangerous country for just two people to be moving valuable livestock. We are managing fine." The man smiled, showing yellowed teeth. "I am sure you are, but you know we could provide escort services, make sure nothing unfortunate happens. For a reasonable fee, of course." "We are not interested," Isaac said flatly. The smile faded from the man's face. "That is unwise, friend. You never know what kind of trouble you might run into out here. Rustlers, hostile Indians, bad weather. Lots of ways to lose cattle or worse." Zelda felt fear curl in her stomach, but she kept her face impassive, her hand resting casually on her thigh near where her pistol hung. Isaac's posture had not changed, but she could sense the tension in him, the readiness for violence if it became necessary. "We will take our chances," Isaac said. "Now, if you will excuse us, we have ground to cover." The leader stared at them for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he shrugged. "Your choice, but do not say we did not offer to help when things go wrong." He and his men wheeled their horses and rode back the way they had come, but Zelda knew with cold certainty that they had not seen the last of them. When the men were out of sight, she said, "They will come back." "Tonight, probably," Isaac agreed. "They will wait until they think we are asleep and try to stampede the herd. In the chaos, they will cut out as many as they can and disappear before we can stop them." "What do we do?" Isaac thought for a moment, his eyes scanning the landscape ahead. "There, see that ridge? We push the herd to the base of it and make camp. The cattle will have the high ground at their backs, which means anyone trying to stampede them can only come from 3 sides. We take turns on watch, and we make it clear we are ready for trouble. Sometimes, that is enough to make men like that look for easier prey." They did as Isaac suggested, and when the herd was settled, they built their fire larger than usual, a signal that they were awake and alert. As darkness fell, Isaac checked his rifle and pistol, and Zelda did the same with her weapons. They did not talk much, both conserving energy for what might be a long night. Zelda took the first watch, walking the perimeter of the camp while Isaac rested with his hat pulled low over his eyes. The night was cool and clear, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. The cattle were restless, sensing perhaps the tension in the air, and Zelda kept up a steady circuit, her rifle in her hands and her ears straining for any sound that did not belong. The attack came near midnight, not from the direction she had been watching but from the east, where the ridge provided cover. She heard the hoofbeats a moment before 3 riders came charging toward the herd, whooping and firing pistols into the air. The cattle immediately panicked, surging to their feet in a terrified mass. But the ridge behind them and the careful positioning Isaac had chosen kept them from scattering completely. Zelda fired a shot into the air, a signal to Isaac, and then she was running toward the herd, shouting to try to calm the animals. Isaac appeared beside her almost instantly, his own rifle in hand, and together they positioned themselves between the rustlers and the cattle. Isaac fired a shot that kicked up dirt near one rider's horse, and the animal shied violently, nearly throwing its rider. "Get out of here," Isaac shouted, his voice carrying across the chaos. "Or the next one goes through flesh instead of dirt." For a tense moment, it could have gone either way. Then one of the rustlers wheeled his horse and rode off into the darkness, and the others followed, their attempted stampede a failure. The cattle were still agitated, milling and calling out, but they had not scattered, and as Zelda and Isaac moved among them, speaking in low, calm voices, they gradually settled. When the herd was quiet again, Isaac and Zelda returned to their camp. Zelda found she was shaking, adrenaline and fear catching up to her now that the danger had passed. Isaac took her rifle gently and set it aside, then placed his hands on her shoulders. "You did well," he said, his face close to hers in the firelight. "You did not panic, and you did exactly what needed to be done." "I was terrified," Zelda confessed. "So was I, but we handled it together and the herd is safe. That is what matters." She looked up at him, at the concern and pride in his expression, and something inside her broke free of its restraints. She reached up, placed her hand against his cheek, and before she could second-guess herself, she kissed him for a heartbeat. Isaac went still with surprise. Then his arms came around her, pulling her close, and he kissed her back with a tenderness and passion that made her knees weak. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since the moment I saw you," he admitted, his voice rough. "Sitting on that horse like some kind of warrior queen covered in dust and determination." Zelda laughed, the sound startled and joyful. "I must have looked terrible. You looked magnificent, you still do." She kissed him again, slower this time, savoring the feeling of being held, of being wanted, of not being alone. When they finally pulled apart, she said, "What happens when we reach Prescott? Will you ride away to your next job?" "Not if you do not want me to," Isaac said. "I told you I was heading nowhere in particular. If you will have me, I would like to see where this goes. Maybe help you rebuild your ranch if you need a hand. Maybe build something together." "I would like that," Zelda whispered. "I would like that very much." They stayed awake the rest of the night, keeping watch together. And as the sun rose over the Arizona desert, painting the rocks and cacti in shades of gold and crimson, Zelda felt hope unfurling in her chest like a flower after rain. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew now that she would not face them alone. The final days to Prescott passed without further incident. The rustlers did not return, perhaps discouraged by the failed ambush, and the weather held clear and mild. Zelda and Isaac rode side by side, their conversations ranging from practical matters about the ranch to hopes and dreams they had never shared with another soul. At night, they sat close by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes simply enjoying each other's presence, and they shared kisses that grew steadily more passionate as their connection deepened. On the afternoon of September 27th, 1883, they drove the herd into the stockyards on the outskirts of Prescott. Zelda felt her throat tighten as she looked over the cattle, counting heads and calculating what they would bring. They had lost 19 animals total on the journey, a better number than she had dared hope for when she was alone, and the surviving cattle, though thin, were healthy enough to command a fair price. The stockyard manager, a portly man named Thompson, came out to inspect the herd. He walked among the animals, examining them with a critical eye, and finally named a price that was less than Zelda had hoped for but more than she had feared. She negotiated for another hour, using every trick her father had taught her, and managed to raise the offer by $100. When she finally shook Thompson's hand to seal the deal, she felt a wave of relief so powerful it nearly knocked her off her feet. Isaac steadied her with a hand on her elbow, and when she looked at him, she saw pride shining in his eyes. "You did it," he said quietly. "You saved your ranch." "We did it," Zelda corrected. "I could not have made it without you, Isaac." They collected the payment, a bank draft that Zelda folded carefully into her shirt pocket, and then they led their exhausted horses to a livery stable where the animals could be properly cared for. The stableman promised them baths and grain and rest, and Zelda felt guilty leaving her mare but knew the animal had earned comfort. Isaac took her hand as they walked toward Prescott's main street. "What would you like to do first?" he asked. "Get a hot meal, a real bed, a bath." "All of those things," Zelda said, and then she stopped walking and turned to face him. "But first, I need to say something. These past 2 weeks with you have been the best of my life, even with the danger and the exhaustion. You have been kind and patient and strong, and you have never once made me feel less capable because I am a woman. You have treated me as a partner, and that means more to me than I know how to express." Isaac smiled, the expression soft and full of affection. "You are a partner, Zelda. In every way that matters. And I meant what I said before. If you will have me, I want to be part of your life. I want to help you rebuild your ranch and make it into something your grandmother and father would be proud of. I want to wake up beside you every morning and fall asleep with you every night. I am in love with you, and I think I have been since that first day." Tears spilled down Zelda's cheeks, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "I am in love with you too, Isaac Calloway. And yes, I will have you. I want you beside me for all of it, the hard work and the good times and everything in between." He kissed her there in the middle of the street, and Zelda did not care who saw or what they thought. She wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back with all the emotion she had been holding inside, all the fear and relief and love and hope that had been building since he rode into her life. When they finally broke apart, Isaac took her hand again and said, "Let us find a hotel room, a respectable one with 2 beds if you prefer, and we can figure out the rest as we go." "1 bed is fine," Zelda said, meeting his eyes directly. "I am tired of being alone, Isaac. I do not want to spend another night apart from you." They found a modest hotel near the center of town, and the proprietor, a stern-faced woman with silver hair, rented them a room after examining them both with a sharp gaze that suggested she missed very little. The room was small but clean, with a real bed covered in a faded quilt, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, and a window that overlooked the street. Zelda sank onto the bed with a sigh of pure pleasure, the mattress soft after weeks of sleeping on the hard ground. Isaac sat beside her, and they stayed like that for a moment, shoulders touching, simply absorbing the fact that they had made it, that they were safe, that they had succeeded. "We should send a telegram to your family," Zelda said eventually. "Let them know you are all right, and that you will be staying in Arizona for the foreseeable future." "Tomorrow," Isaac agreed. "Tonight, I just want to be here with you." They helped each other out of their dusty, travel-stained clothes, and Zelda felt a flicker of nervousness mixed with anticipation. But Isaac was gentle and patient, his touches reverent, and when they finally came together, it felt like the most natural thing in the world, a physical expression of the emotional connection they had forged on the trail. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the small bed, skin against skin, and Zelda felt a contentment she had never known existed. Isaac traced idle patterns on her shoulder, his touch soothing, and she nestled closer against him. "I used to think I would never find someone who understood what it meant to love this land the way I do," Zelda murmured, "who saw it as a partner rather than something to be conquered." "The land demands respect," Isaac agreed. "It will break anyone who tries to dominate it. But if you work with it, listen to it, it can give you a life worth living. Will you marry me, Isaac Calloway?" He went still, and then he shifted so he could look down at her face. "I am supposed to be the one asking that question." "I do not care much for supposed to," Zelda said with a slight smile. "I know what I want and I am asking for it. Will you marry me?" "Yes," Isaac said, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Zelda Emerson, I will marry you." I will marry you and spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret asking." They were married 3 days later by a justice of the peace, with the hotel proprietor and her husband serving as witnesses. Zelda wore a simple blue dress purchased from the general store, and Isaac bought a new shirt for the occasion, but neither of them cared much about the trappings. What mattered was the vows they spoke, promising to stand beside each other through whatever challenges life brought, to build something lasting together, to honor the love they had found in the most unlikely of circumstances. After the brief ceremony, they celebrated with a proper meal at Prescott's finest restaurant, and then they returned to their hotel room and made love with the slow tenderness of people who knew they had all the time in the world ahead of them. The next week was spent making arrangements. Zelda deposited the money from the cattle sale in a bank account, keeping enough aside for supplies and the journey back to the ranch. She sent a letter to her father's lawyer in Tucson, informing him that the debt had been settled and the ranch was secure. Isaac sold his blue roan to the livery stable owner, who had admired the animal from the first day, and used the money to purchase tools and equipment they would need for rebuilding. They bought a small herd of breeding cows and a bull, a foundation to rebuild the ranch's livestock. They purchased chickens and seeds for a kitchen garden, and Isaac insisted on buying a pair of goats as well, claiming fresh milk and cheese would make all the difference in their quality of life. Zelda found herself agreeing to things she would never have considered before, trusting Isaac's judgment and experience, and finding joy in making decisions as a partnership rather than bearing the burden alone. The journey back to the ranch took 2 weeks, slower than the drive to Prescott, because they were not pushing the animals to exhaustion. They camped under the stars each night, and Isaac taught Zelda songs his mother had sung, and she told him stories about her grandmother's adventures in the early days of the territory. They made love beneath the vast Arizona sky, and Zelda marveled at how completely her life had transformed in such a short time. When they finally reached the ranch, Zelda felt a complicated mix of emotions. The buildings looked smaller and more worn than she remembered, the fences in need of repair, the corrals empty and sad. But beside her, Isaac dismounted and looked around with an assessing eye that was devoid of judgment. "Good bones," he said finally. "Everything here is fixable. We will have it running smooth within a year." They set to work immediately, falling into a routine that combined hard physical labor with the pleasure of building something together. Isaac repaired fences and corrals while Zelda cleaned out the house and made it habitable again. They worked from dawn until dusk, and at night they collapsed into bed exhausted but satisfied. Their bodies pressed close together, finding comfort and passion even in their weariness. As the weeks passed, the ranch began to transform. The fences were mended, the corrals rebuilt, the house cleaned and furnished with items they purchased on trips to Superior. The breeding cattle settled into their new home, and the chickens began laying eggs regularly. Isaac built a proper barn to replace the sagging structure that had been there before, and Zelda planted a garden that she tended with the same fierce determination she brought to everything else. In November, Isaac rode into Superior and returned with news. "The territorial governor is talking about pushing for statehood again," he told Zelda over dinner. "Could happen within the next few years. Arizona is growing, changing. We are part of that now." "Does that excite you or worry you?" Zelda asked. Isaac considered the question. "Both, I suppose. Change always brings uncertainty, but I think it is good overall. More law, more stability, more opportunity for people to build real lives instead of just surviving day to day. My grandmother used to say that every generation has to fight for their place in the world," Zelda said. We fought with land and cattle. Maybe the next generation will fight with different tools, but they will still be fighting. If they are our children, they will be fighters, Isaac agreed with a smile. Stubborn and determined and absolutely unwilling to give up. The mention of children made Zelda's heart skip. They had not specifically discussed starting a family, but the idea had been hovering unspoken between them. "Would you want children?" she asked carefully. "With you?" "Yes, if you want them too." "I do," Zelda admitted. "Not right away, perhaps. I want to get the ranch fully established first. But someday, yes. I want to have a family with you, Isaac." He reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb rubbing over her knuckles. "Then we will have that. Everything in its time." Winter in Arizona was mild compared to the harsh seasons Isaac remembered from Colorado, but there was still work to be done. They spent the cooler months making improvements to the house, adding a second room and building a proper fireplace. Isaac taught Zelda to play the harmonica, and though she was not particularly skilled, he claimed her efforts were charming. She taught him to read better, for though he knew the basics, he had never had much formal education, and she wanted him to be able to handle the ranch's business affairs with confidence. They received a letter from Isaac's mother in Denver, responding to the one he had sent informing her of his marriage. She wrote warmly, welcoming Zelda to the family and expressing hope that they would visit someday so she could meet her new daughter-in-law. The letter made Isaac quiet and thoughtful for the rest of the day, and that night he held Zelda especially close, as though her presence could fill the ache of missing his family. Spring brought new life to the ranch. The cattle dropped healthy calves, and Zelda felt fierce pride watching the small herd grow. The garden flourished under her care, providing fresh vegetables that made their meals more varied and satisfying. They hired a young man named Thomas from Superior to help with the heaviest work, and he proved reliable and hardworking, grateful for steady employment and fair treatment. On a warm evening in May, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple, Zelda realized her monthly courses were late. She said nothing to Isaac at first, not wanting to raise hopes that might be dashed. But as the days passed and the signs became unmistakable, she could no longer keep the secret. They were sitting on the porch after dinner, watching the horses graze in the pasture when she said, "Isaac, I think I am pregnant." He went very still, and then he turned to look at her, his eyes wide. "You think or you know, I am as certain as I can be without seeing a doctor. All the signs are there." A slow smile spread across Isaac's face, transforming him into someone almost boyish with joy. "We are going to have a baby." "We are going to have a baby," Zelda confirmed. And then she was laughing and crying at the same time, and Isaac was kissing her and holding her gently, as though she had suddenly become fragile. The pregnancy was easier than Zelda had feared, though she was sick in the mornings for the first few months and tired all the time. Isaac took over more of the heavy work, insisting she rest even when she protested that she was perfectly capable. They made plans, converting the second room into a nursery, purchasing a cradle from a carpenter in Superior, preparing for the new life that would join them. In December 1884, during a cool night when the stars seemed close enough to touch, Zelda went into labor. Isaac rode for the midwife in Superior, a capable woman named Mrs. Henderson, who had delivered half the babies in the territory. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Zelda thought she could not endure another contraction, but Isaac stayed beside her the entire time, holding her hand and murmuring encouragement, and eventually, a baby's cry split the air. "A boy, Mrs. Henderson announced, wrapping the squalling infant in a clean blanket. "A healthy, strong boy." She placed the baby in Zelda's arms, and Zelda looked down at her son with wonder. He had a shock of dark hair like his father and a determined cry that suggested he would not be easily ignored. Isaac leaned over them both, his eyes shining with tears, and gently touched one tiny fist. "He is perfect," Isaac whispered. "You are perfect. Thank you, Zelda." They named him James after Zelda's father, with Isaac's surname of Calloway. In the weeks that followed, they adjusted to life with an infant, the sleepless nights and constant demands balanced by moments of pure joy when James smiled or made small cooing sounds. Isaac proved to be a devoted father, walking the floor with the baby when he fussed, changing diapers without complaint, marveling at every small development. The ranch continued to prosper. By 1886, they had doubled the size of their herd and were able to hire 2 more hands permanently. The house was expanded again, with a proper parlor and a larger kitchen, and Zelda finally had the piano she had always dreamed of, purchased from a family leaving the territory and transported carefully from Superior. In the spring of 1887, Zelda gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Alina after Isaac's mother. She was a quieter baby than James had been, with her mother's green eyes and a solemn expression that made her seem wise beyond her months. James, now 2.5, was fascinated by his little sister, wanting to help with everything and bringing her his favorite toys as gifts. The years flowed past, marked by the rhythms of ranch life and the growth of their family. Arizona achieved statehood in 1889, and Isaac and Zelda celebrated by hosting a party for all their neighbors, providing food and music and toasts to the future. Their ranch had become one of the most respected operations in the territory, known for quality cattle and fair dealing, and Zelda felt her grandmother's spirit approving from whatever place she now resided. In 1890, their third child was born, another boy they named Samuel. He came into the world with a lusty cry and a head of bright red hair that neither parent could quite explain, though Isaac claimed his father's mother had been a redhead. Samuel proved to be the wildest of their children, always climbing, always exploring, and Zelda spent much of his early years keeping him from various disasters. By 1895, the ranch encompassed over 3,000 acres, much of it purchased from neighbors who were retiring or moving on to other ventures. They ran 500 head of cattle and had built a reputation that extended beyond Arizona's borders. James, now 10, was already showing a gift for understanding animals, while Alina at 8 was proving to have a head for numbers and business that pleased both her parents. Samuel at 5 was still mostly concerned with mischief, but even he was learning to ride and help with simple chores. One evening in late summer, as the family sat on the expanded porch watching the sunset, James asked, "Mama, how did you and Papa meet?" Zelda exchanged a glance with Isaac, seeing her own memories reflected in his eyes. "That is a long story," she said. "We want to hear it," Alina insisted. "You never tell us about before we were born." So Zelda began to speak, telling her children about the cattle drive, about the weeks she spent alone after her father's death, about the morning Isaac rode into her life and changed everything. She did not soften the hardships or pretend the journey had been easy, but she also conveyed the beauty of the land, the satisfaction of accomplishing something that seemed impossible, the way love could appear when you least expected it. Isaac picked up the story when she faltered, describing their first camp together, the attempted rustling, the arrival in Prescott. The children listened with wide eyes, clearly seeing their parents as people rather than just the adults who ran the household. And when the story was finished, James said, "You were very brave, Mama." "Your mother is the bravest person I have ever known," Isaac said, reaching over to take Zelda's hand. "She taught me what real courage looks like. You taught me what partnership means, Zelda countered. What it means to trust someone completely. Alina wrinkled her nose. Is this going to get mushy? Because if it is, I am going inside. Everyone laughed, the moment lightening, and Samuel jumped up to demonstrate a new rope trick he had been practicing. But later, after the children were in bed, Isaac and Zelda sat together on the porch swing they had installed the previous year, moving gently in the cooling air. "Do you ever regret it?" Isaac asked quietly. "Agreeing to let me ride with you that day. Your life might have been simpler if you had sent me away." "Simpler, perhaps," Zelda said, "but not better, not nearly as good. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Isaac Calloway, you and our children and this life we built together." "I used to think I was wandering," Isaac mused. "Moving from job to job, never settling. But I was really searching, and when I found you, I knew the search was over. You were what I had been looking for all along." They sat in comfortable silence, hands intertwined, watching the stars emerge one by one. In the distance, cattle lowed softly, and somewhere an owl called. The land stretched around them, vast and challenging and beautiful, and Zelda felt a deep sense of belonging, of rightness. The years continued to unfold, bringing changes and challenges as all years do. They weathered droughts and hard winters, market fluctuations and the occasional illness. James grew into a fine young man who took over more of the ranch operations, eventually marrying a teacher from Phoenix and bringing her home to the ranch. Alina pursued her education with fierce determination, eventually becoming one of the first women to attend the university in Tucson, studying business and returning to help modernize the ranch's operations. Samuel, after several wild years that made his parents gray with worry, finally settled down and discovered a talent for horse breeding that added a profitable new dimension to their business. Isaac and Zelda grew older together, their hair silvering, their bodies showing the wear of decades of hard work. But their love never diminished, and they still sought each other's company above all others. They celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary in 1916 surrounded by children and grandchildren, and Isaac stood to make a toast. 30 years ago," he said, his voice still strong despite his age, "I was a drifter with no particular place to go. Then I met a woman driving a herd of cattle alone across Arizona, and she was the most magnificent thing I had ever seen. She did not need me, but she let me ride beside her anyway, and that decision changed both our lives. Everything good in my life stems from that moment, from her willingness to accept help, from her courage and strength and love. Zelda, you are still the most magnificent thing I have ever seen, and I thank God every day that I found you." Zelda stood and kissed him to the applause and cheers of their family, and she whispered in his ear, "You found me, and I kept you. Best decision I ever made." They continued working the ranch together into their 60s, finally stepping back only when their bodies insisted they could no longer manage the physical demands. James took over primary operations, with Alina handling the business side and Samuel managing the horse breeding program. The ranch thrived under the next generation's care, expanding and adapting to the changing times while maintaining the core values of hard work and fair dealing that Isaac and Zelda had instilled. In 1925, on a warm spring afternoon, Isaac and Zelda sat on their porch as they had thousands of times before. They were both in their 60s now, their hands gnarled from years of work, but still finding each other instinctively. The ranch spread before them, a testament to everything they had built, and their great-grandchildren played in the yard, their laughter carrying on the breeze. "We did well," Isaac said quietly. "Your grandmother would be proud." "She would," Zelda agreed. "And your mother too. We honored them by building something that lasts." "I love you," Isaac said, the words as heartfelt as the first time he had spoken them. "Every day I love you more." "And I love you," Zelda replied. "Today, tomorrow, and all the days after. You rode beside me when I needed you most, and you never left. That is what love is, Isaac, showing up and staying through everything." They sat together as the sun painted the sky in brilliant colors. Two people who had found each other against all odds and built a life that exceeded anything either had dreamed possible. The cattle grazed peacefully, the horses ran in their pastures, and the land stretched endlessly around them, beautiful and harsh and home. And Isaac Calloway and Zelda Emerson Calloway held hands and watched another sunset over the Arizona desert, grateful for every moment they had been given, every challenge they had faced together, every love they had shared. Their story was complete, their legacy secure, their love eternal.